So I want to say a big thank you to Michael Eisenberg, our author or speaker who is here today from Israel. Michael is an Israeli-American venture capitalist. He's the co-founder and general partner at Aleph. Aleph has, I think, more than $500 million under management, different investments in upcoming startup companies. But in addition to being a venture capitalist, Michael is a Bible scholar, a Torah scholar, has studied for years since childhood, and actually runs a blog as well. 6 kids in full time, where he covers everything from economics to technology to VC to Israel as well. So big thank you. I know this is not your first book. I think you've written 5 in Hebrew. Sadly, I don't know Hebrew, but I have been reading this the last few days, The Tree of Life and Prosperity, and just really, really happy to have you at Heritage Foundation today. So thank you, and we'll kick it off to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Sorry I'm late. Legit, you can't make this up. They lost my coat at the restaurant I was at, and it took 10-15 minutes to find my coat. So
yeah,
was everybody
that one before.
have you heard? Yeah. So thanks for having me. Joel asked me to prepare some remarks, so I did. I wrote, but we can make this interactive and we have plenty of time for questions. I promise not to drone on. And if you find the prepared remarks provocative and want to interrupt, that's totally fine. And so I'll jump in. So first of all, I just want to thank Joel again, and thank Jonathan Bernitsky, who I think made the original introduction to the Heritage Foundation. And really thank you for having me here. I think the work you do here is super important. One of the topics Joel asked me to talk about was big tech and censorship. But the proximate impetus for this conversation is the publication of my most recent book, The Tree of Life and Prosperity.
I hear some stereo. No, I don't think so.
No, that's worse. Right.
You know what it is?
Wait, you kill it coming out of there, yeah.
And you know, the reality is you are so good, you love to hear you twice.
Right.
Perhaps what could happen is, could we mute the speakers on the devices up there? Yes.
We tried that song. We have people who aren't.
Oh, then it gets there.
Yeah, now we're back.
Call. Oh, now we're back.
Turn that.
Echo. All right, echo.
All right, that's better. That's better.
Better. Better.
Are we good?
Better.
All right, here we are. So lonely now.
Now we can complain about big tech. Now that we fixed our tech.
So as I was saying, the proximate cause of the conversation is the publication of the most recent book, The Tree of Life and Prosperity, which lives at the intersection of the Hebrew Bible, ancient and modern economics, and our technological age. The case I made, which seems to have resonated candidly way beyond anything I expected, is that ancients have what to teach us moderns, that our problems and challenges are not new, and perhaps in addition, in these divisive and changing times and stormy seas, timeless principles can provide anchors. I want to briefly touch on 3 topics, hopefully I won't bore you, for which the wisdom of ancients can inform us moderns. The first thing, this will come as no surprise to you, is that freedom of speech is under assault right now. It is not the legal tenet of free speech that's crumbling, but rather the practice of free speech. Free speech is not merely a right, it is a responsibility. For it is the freedom to speak that enables breakthrough thinking, the type of innovative thinking and action that challenges the prevailing zeitgeist and moves us forward as a society. Therefore, a common acceptable set of pronouns and language, A single acceptable form of words condemns society to stagnation and free thinkers to societal damnation. Constrained speech allows society and media to mangle words and apply them to facts, biological facts, financial facts, and civic facts that do not suffer those words. It is postmodernism at its best when, due to acceptable language, words actually lose their meaning. Just yesterday, Amnesty International released a report calling Israel an apartheid state. It is a lie. I live there. But the word apartheid also lost its meaning in this progressive Pravda. It's disrespectful, actually, to Nelson Mandela and maliciously oblivious to the makeup of Israel and its current government. Just 2 days ago, the Holocaust was stripped of its meaning by Whoopi Goldberg. In what world is Hitler not a racist? In a world where de facto society has decided what white and black means and what you're allowed to say and think. But I'm thankful, I want to say this, that she apologized last night in the heartfelt way, and I don't think she should be sanctioned. I recently finished Matt Ridley and Alina Chan's excellent book called Viral on the Origins of the Pandemic. Did you read it? It's amazing. It's very persuasive, even if it tries not to be, that this virus leaked from a lab. Probably not maliciously, but a leak nonetheless. The lab leak theory was not just dismissed, but its advocates deplatformed from social media. The lab leak theory is still not debated sufficiently in the halls of government. Social media, which could be the greatest guarantor of free speech ever created, and in some measures we can admit it has been, unfortunately has been captured by the builders of the Tower of Babel. I want to emphasize that this is not just about free speech or words. It leads to real physical and even life-threatening consequences. It's dangerous. By not discussing nor looking seriously at the lab leak theory, we likely sacrifice people's lives and livelihoods. More dangerously, we took the pressing issues of biodefense, biosafety, and security off the table. If the zoonotic virus just jumped, well, there's little we can do. If it was the result of gain-of-function tinkering, we have a lot of work to do, from looking at funding sources, including DARPA, and urgently re-examining biosecurity and biodefenses. Perhaps moreover, there are real ethical issues we need to immediately confront. I do not think big tech started with malicious intent, and here I think the story of the Tower of Babel is very, very instructive. The innovators of humanity then descended on the valley in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. Then it was a valley of bricks, not silicon. They built a tower, and the Bible tells us that they were of one tongue, one language, one singular set of things or thoughts that were acceptable. They wanted to make a name for themselves, a big name. They were a really advanced society building a skyscraper in ancient times. It was certainly a marvel of technology and human ingenuity, but they used the venture to create homogeneity of thought and language and acceptable thinking. God descended to see what this innovation that man had wrought, what were the values these tower builders promulgated, and when he saw the homogeneity of language and thought, God scattered them, mixing their tongues, their languages, and in the process creating heterogeneous thought and heterodoxy of belief. Only after this great scattering could Abraham, a beacon of hope, optimism and empowerment emerge into the world. I wonder often what the Bible is telling us in this case. And to paraphrase the Latin, in imitatio Dei, we are supposed to imitate God. We're not supposed to be God or all powerful, but to imitate his actions. If we want to enable truly free speech and human flourishing, we need to open the social graph, my data, and take it out of central control. I do not believe that most politicians understand this when they say break up big tech. This is important. Humbly, I don't think most of them think or understand the arc of technology sufficiently to propose a solution. And that's a big problem. In these cases, as we propose solutions, we need to keep the biblical and modern goal in mind and find the right tools. Our goal is not to break up big tech, but to enable freedom of speech and thought without risk of actual, virtual, financial, or civic deplatforming, both de jure and de facto. It's not just the law, it's also what happens in practice. With that, I want to move to the economy briefly. I think we all sense that something is amiss in our economy. The invisible hand seems to be ever more invisible and perhaps less impactful. I think we all sense that we're living a moment in history where divisiveness has overwhelmed our common goals of a meaningful, prosperous life. I want to emphasize meaningful and prosperous life, where opportunists are more abundant than opportunity, where there's a need to make opportunity and growth accessible to ever more people, where tragically new packaging of failed ideas on capital and capitalism are finding new naive audiences. It's in these challenging times, again, we must look to the wisdom of the ancients and apply it to us moderns. We need to look at these deep anchors that stabilize us in these stormy seas. Here too, the wisdom of the Bible, which we'll explore today, can be helpful. I want to start by briefly telling you about two formative encounters that I had. If you read my book, one of them is in there. I had brief but meaningful encounters with the head of the yeshiva, House of Religious Study, that I studied in the hills outside of Jerusalem in 1989 through 1991. Rabbi Dr. Aaron Lichtenstein earned his doctorate from Harvard on John Milton's poetry. He was a giant Bible and Talmudic scholar. I was a 19-year-old, interested and curious, and I approached him hesitantly in the noisy study hall. I waited patiently. He had all these books around him that were piled way high. He picked up his head and I asked him, this could sound completely old-fashioned and old, but some of us are old enough in this room, if you could copy on a double cassette player from a cassette that you had purchased of music and transfer it to a blank cassette. It's like sharing a Netflix password today. He looked up from his pile of Talmudic books and said to me in a soft but deep voice, if you purchase it, then you own it, and nobody can tell you what to do with your possessions. The rights belong to you, he said, but you will not get a gold medal for the biblical instruction to be holy, which is to do the right thing even when you are not legally mandated to do so. It was there that I understood that in gray areas lie greatness, and one finds God when there is a fog. The second was an interaction with the other head of the yeshiva, Rabbi Amital, who was a Holocaust survivor, a man of more traditional Jewish education. He was also a Talmudic giant, but he really understood the human spirit. I asked him whether he thought there was a bigger commandment to move to Israel and settle the land in an unpopulated place, or settling in a populated place was the same fulfillment of the commandment. It was a Jewish law question. And he looked at me and wagged his finger and said, that is complete and utter nonsense, your question. What you need to do is move to Israel and set up a factory that will employ 10,000 people to earn an honest and decent living. It was a wow moment for me that empowering others economically was a religious imperative. In both these stories, I find not merely inspiration, but rather economic truths and the core values of religion, and they reinforce one another. That growth and prosperity is a religious imperative. There's a religious imperative to ensure that my personal growth and prosperity empowers other people. It may not be a legal imperative, but it is a civic, societal, and religious imperative because religion is important for civic society. In 1831, French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville said, in the United States, I'm sure you've all learned this, as soon as several inhabitants have taken an opinion or an idea they wish to promote in society, they seek each other out and unite together once they have made contact. From that moment, they are no longer isolated, but have become a power. This was and is an economic truth as much as a civic truth. De Tocqueville was bullish on America because he saw the spirit of volunteerism and church attendance was so high. In the span of history, de Tocqueville's observations were not that long ago. However, in our own postmodern experience, it feels like it was millennia ago. We've lost something. The spirit of volunteerism has waned along with church attendance, and that is impacting the dynamism and broad growth of our economy. It's not just the loss of broad economic growth, but because vacuums do not persist, as church attendance and volunteerism wane, we find ourselves living with short-term highs and self-righteous anger rather than long-term righteous treatment of the other. That self-righteous anger, the incessant need for self-expression and selfies, has led to hyperpartisanship, a pandemic of mistrust, and petty selfishness. I'll suggest that when the founding fathers of America adopted Adam Smith capitalism as the foundation of the US economy, the baker and the cobbler powering the invisible hand were rooted in religious and civic foundations and assumptions. The economy, capitalism, was not bifurcated from religious society or church going. Volunteering people. The underlying assumptions of American capitalism were fundamentally Judeo-Christian. The power of community and the community of empowerment that religion creates were central to economic prosperity. If we want to really get our economy growing again in a healthy manner, we need to rediscover the volunteerism, the mutual sacrifice and mutual responsibility that undergird and grow from the community bonds that de Tocqueville so eloquently described. We need to both sacrifice ourselves in the short term and invest in others in the long term. I'm going to offer some controversial suggestions now, and so I apologize in advance. And here I think Israel has actually something to offer and teach. Through mandatory military service, the spirit of volunteerism is alive. It's not perfect, not by a long shot, but it does have the foundations of a resilient and empowering economy and society, and this too is biblical. There's a mandate to do military service or civil service in the Hebrew Bible. It's literally a mitzvah, a commandment. The military is not just a fact of life in a risky world. It is a feature of liveliness or resilience and mutual responsibility. It creates a joie de vivre in an aspirational society. The bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood acquired through sweating and building together hold strong. This in turn powers economic partnership based on trust, the lubricant of every economy. I learned this for what it's worth from my grandfather, who was an officer in the US Navy in World War II, one of his core teachings. The social services sector in Israel, backed by both tzedakah, loosely translated as charity, government, and even revenue that these 501c3s make. I realize that that's anathema in many places that 501c3s should make revenue, but it's a good idea. Is taking on an ever-growing role in civic society as government has become more dysfunctional. Government dysfunction is a global phenomenon. The dysfunction is born of a digital society running up against a government operating system still predicated on the Pony Express. Part of the way we can service the needs of a society without resorting to the labyrinthine government is to lean on a civic society, a strong civic society. This too is biblical. The Bible dictates only a scant few verses to government. The Bible dedicates only a scant few verses to government, to the monarchy, almost exclusively describing the limits on government power. The king cannot accumulate wives, wealth, and horses. The Bible assumes that centralizing power makes society brittle and contentious, preferring instead to devolve that responsibility to citizens. We need to reboot to achieve this biblical vision. We need to invest in initiatives that build solidarity, especially among our young people. America would do well to reinstate the draft for either military or national service prior to sending kids off to college. We need to encourage young people to take more responsibility at a younger age. I see some smiles in the room. To build a culture of caring and mutual responsibility. In my humble opinion, that is not only mandatory military or national service, but hold tight, starting families at a younger age. Children are the beacon of an optimistic future and family, and a clarion call for responsibility. That's in America that de Tocqueville would recognize, and that will create broad economic flourishing. And I just want to pivot from macro to micro for a second. What are the kinds of businesses we build? I know free marketeers look askance at this question. You should build what you want. The free marketeer surely answers, that's true, but I want to persuade you that there will be great businesses built in the 21st century that are rooted in timeless principles. Timeless biblical principles. You will make more money by making other people more money. You will make more money by making other people well off, and this is a good thing, both of them. Not in kind of a superficial, happy way, but in a deep, meaningful way where we enable economic success and freedom, where we ensure alignment of incentives. The Jewish commandment of tzedakah, what I called charity before, is normally called charity or alms, and that's part of it. But really, and this is an important point. The medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides writes that while giving alms is important, a higher form of tzedakah, charity again, is to form a partnership with somebody to invest capital in them. Teaching a man to fish versus providing him dinner. That's why tzedakah is not coextensive or the same thing as charity or alms for the poor. For Maimonides, Jewish law and society, because of an investment and partnership, the investee will no longer need charity. He'll have his own economic growth. And as such, the pie will grow for him and the investor, and that grows the economic pie. Perhaps charity is sacrifice. Jewish tzedakah is investment. Charity creates dependence. Investment creates interdependence, trust. A successful investment creates independence, independent wealth that creates another investor who can then further enable trusted interdependence and mutual success. I invest my current capital, a venture capitalist, to create a different future for the investee, a different future for my community, and a different future for the economy. When you make an investment, particularly in a risky venture, which is the nature of venture capital, you know full well that most often you will lose that money. At the same time, as an investor or partner, I believe that I can create, or more accurately, the entrepreneur can create, a different and a better future. The same is true for investing in our neighbors and in our communities and local businesses. I may lose my money, but he or she can make a different future, one that radiates out from his family to a community and to the economy as a whole. It is solidarity created by sacrifice or near-term sacrifice of consumption that will grow our individual and collective pie. As religious people, we should want to make money and should want other people to make more money. We should not subsist on basic needs alone. This is different from some modern proposals for universal basic income, a notion that I address and don't quite like in my book. The best defense for UBI is that it frees people to take risks. This has not been my experience, observed or otherwise. I can, if you're interested, recommend Albert Wegner's book on the world after capital, where he advocates for UBI. However, my own view, much like in the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve had their basic needs provided for, and so they did absolutely nothing, not even talking to each other nor having children, UBI will create boredom and a lack of productivity. With UBI, there is no sense of partnership, no mutual sweat and work, and no risk-taking, nor investment in someone else. We can invest in training people. We must invest in training people. When the Bible describes the imperative to leave behind a corner of your field for the poor, it insists that the poor person harvest the land for himself. This is important. He may be down on his luck, but he needs to work to learn skills of the farmer and the baker. Through sacrificing a corner of my field, I give the unemployed person both dignity and a chance to hone his skills. We need that in the 21st century. Employers and factories can provide these same opportunities to the unemployed to come work in those factories and learn skills and get off unemployment or stimulus checks. We make money so we can invest in the economy and others, even making risky investments so that together we create a much better future and a bigger pie for all of us. And that requires us to adopt an investor's mindset. As I said, some investments may go to zero, mine do all the time. That happens. So while they may lose money, they will foster skills, trust, and mutual responsibility. Perhaps this is the modern community mindset, an investor mindset. This is what we need to recapture. You know what? I'll pause for a second. I wanted to talk about some investments, but I think maybe a good time to open up for questions. If we have time, I want to talk about individual businesses that have created and aligned incentives and aligned 21st century capitalism to what I think will get us out of consumption capitalism. But
No, actually, I think it would be helpful to do that first.
Okay.
Because then that would really broaden up the aperture of what we can talk about afterwards.
great, I will do that.
And others, I'm afraid we'll just forget it at the back end, and a lot of folks are interested in that.
Awesome. So it's not just the people we invest in, it's also the products we create. In my last decade of investing, I discovered something that I was insufficiently aware of previously, or that maybe the timing was not yet right for. Great timeless values and principles create great products and companies that disrupt markets. I'll give you two examples. These examples stand out because much of the criticism of capitalism today has been leveled at the financial markets or the financialization of the economy. Some of that thrust come from recent suggestions by politicians such as Marco Rubio Porwallian for common good capitalism, and they take aim at financial services and their leaders. I think it's fixable for what it's worth, just like Maimonides' investment in the neighbor. And if we get it right, we can build big companies and better financial products. Lemonade is the fastest growing insurance company in the world. I was privileged to be the first investor and even introduced the founders. They had a profound insight into insurance. Insurance is the most conflicted business model in the world. Insurance companies, some of the largest companies in our economy, make money from your misery. A traditional insurance company makes money by rejecting your claim. In your time of sorrow after a flood or a car accident, they're actually incentivized to reject your claim because losses from your misfortune hurt their bottom line. What should be a social good is actually a personal nightmare. Moreover, because it's amazing what the human mind does. But they want to reject your claim. The injured person making the claim will often inflate the claim or be encouraged to, nobody in this room does it, of course, but we're being encouraged to defraud the insurance company to ensure he or she gets paid. This, of course, inflates insurance premiums in a vicious cycle. Copying a Netflix password or a cassette is small potatoes compared to insurance fraud. But the conflicted model of insurance leads to this unholy economic disaster. Lemonade said, we can fix this. They designed a company that cut out the broker, making use of an app that not only freed up extra margin, the broker's fee, but also enabled them to collect more data and have a direct relationship with the customer. More and more direct data allowed for better underwriting and better fraud detection. They also changed the business model, and this is crucial. Lemonade collects a fixed percentage of premiums. Whatever is left unclaimed by policyholders goes to the charity of your choice. So if you file a fraudulent claim with Lemonade, you will hurt the American Cancer Society, your local church or synagogue, or local soup kitchen. That turns out to be a real incentive to do the right thing because most people are fundamentally good. You just need to design a system where timeless values and principles lie at the core of the incentives, and we can treat people with dignity instead of suspicions. Lemonade's loss ratios have been plummeting through this combination of technology and timeless principles built right into the product. This is not corporate social responsibility, which my kids call screw the customer and plant some trees. Lemonade built and aligned values that are fundamental to the product and to the business model. They reinforce each other and energize growth. RiseUp, another example, is a company that I invested in with Sir Ronald Cohen and Timberland's former CEO, Jeff Schwartz. The company's CEO is Yuval Samet, an Israeli who sold his first startup to Swedish payments juggernaut Klarna, but who grew up really poor in the old market neighborhood of a Tel Aviv suburb. Yuval looked at the banking system and the people who he grew up with and felt compelled to fix the model. Today, the best customers of banks are those who are in debt and miss some payments, but ultimately pay their loans because they pay fees and penalties. However, as the consumer is not well off socioeconomically, living in debt creates a scarcity mindset, which causes a large percentage of the population to make really bad decisions. Research by Professor Eldar Shafir of Princeton, himself an Israeli, shows that people with a scarcity mindset have a hard time getting jobs and raising children, among other patterns of deterioration. Bangladeshi banker Muhammad Yunus won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work in this area of microloans and microcredit. Yuval Samet and RiseUp, the company I described, said we can do better with humanity-driven technology. The RiseUp AI bot and some small number of humans in the background watch your monthly finances and tell you at any given moment in the month how much you have left to spend. Who's got a Fitbit in the room? So like Fitbit, for those who have it, it gives you one number to optimize for. In Fitbit, it's steps, and in RiseUp, it's how much you have left to spend this month. By doing this, they have moved many, many, many thousands of Israelis out of overdraft and into savings. They turn chronic debtors into investors in their future, a better future for them and their children's society as a whole. They've turned the banking model on its head, selling investment accounts to low-income families at an unbelievably rapid pace. Better values and alignment create better products and fast-growing companies in the 21st century. Beyond the data I get to see as an investor in the company, how do I know it's working? Well, because there's a celebrity who for years promoted Israel's largest bank on television, and he asked to become the public face of RiseUp. The RiseUp commercial he stars in aired for the first time this past Sunday evening to rave reviews. I think there's something uniquely Israeli about this, or perhaps a Jewish view or Judeo-Christian view of the economy that runs deep in both our countries. The Jewish people returned home to the land of Israel some 100+ years ago and founded a state 73 years ago. The exiled Jewish people came from the four corners of the earth, returning back to the Holy Land. For many, as has been repeated often by modern politicians, the purpose of the Jewish state was to find a safe haven for Jewish people from anti-Semitism, which has unfortunately again reared its ugly head, 76 years after the Holocaust. Candidly, I think this is a partial perspective at best. The safe haven was the most urgent objective and still necessary, but it's truly insufficient. Similarly, when the early settlers came to America, they fled religious persecution, but wanted to build something much more. Fleeing religious persecution was not enough. Early Americans correctly aspired to set up a model society, a society that had a different kind of economy and a different kind of religious freedom. In Israel as well, we have an opportunity based on our religious and cultural heritage to set up a different kind of economy. And here too, I want to aspire. I'll argue that the separation of church and state on a government level is critical for both freedom of religion and to ensure that the state does not usurp God. However, on an economic level, we need to rethink what has become a godless consumption capitalism. More pointedly, I think we make a mistake when we forget that church and state are supposed to be separate from a governance perspective. However, our job as individuals is to integrate the two. The founders never intended, I would posit, that individuals check their religious beliefs at the door when they work and vote. This, I think, is the point. Caesar and priests need to stay in their lane, but we as individuals, we need to be integrated thinkers and economic actors. I believe that Israel as a Jewish state, together with the United States in a reinvigorated Judeo-Christian view of the world, can lead the world forward out of consumption capitalism. I'm rolling this term out for the first time right now. I want to suggest that maybe we can call it covenantal capitalism. In a covenant, somebody sacrifices, invests. Somebody invests in an unknown outcome. In the Jewish view of circumcision, you enter a covenant by sacrificing a small piece of your body to enter peoplehood. In covenantal capitalism, you make risky investments in your neighbor's business, in your communities, or invest your time and perhaps also risk your life in a year of military community service. In all cases, you must serve something greater than yourself. In the 21st century, business is the best purveyor of values, and principles are best sustained with business and by business. Lemonade and Rise Up not only build businesses based on timeless biblical principles of empowerment, of investing in the success of your neighbor and civic society through alignment. What's that?
Sorry, someone's trying to join.
Oh, they create fast-growing digital businesses that grow all of our pies. It is the economy that can bring people together, provided that we citizens take responsibility and make the investment to up-level people into 21st century skills and drive their economic success. To do this, we must take real risk. That spirit of sacrifice and investment underlies community solidarity and how we grow this together. With the roots, the biblical roots we share. With a commitment to brotherhood and economy of brotherhood, we will not live a redistributed future, nor leave a redistributed future to our children. Much like young people taking responsibility through service and building families, we can do that through investment and an investor mindset. We will invest, make risky investments in our brothers and sisters, our small businesses in our communities, and our values-infused products with full knowledge that it might be a sacrifice, but also with full belief that all of our futures will be brighter. We are still at the beginning of this project. In both nascent Israel and the slightly more established America, we are all still building toward a brighter future. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Michael. I guess I'll take the program as the first question. I know in your book you talked quite a bit about just ancient biblical characters, and one of them was Noah. And you talked about the innovation that Noah brought to the world and how the world wasn't had the innovation, but society was not yet prepared for the innovation that led to degradation. Could you talk a bit about that and what, according to biblical tradition, led to the flood and parallels that you see with modern society? And lastly, what we or what the government working through us could actually do to address that?
I only wish that I had written the chapter on Noah when we had more information about this pandemic. So Noah, the sages tell us, but it's obviously from the verses, invented the plow. He's the first inventor of the mechanical plow, at least in biblical storytelling. And he invents the plow and he unleashes prosperity. You can see as people start to have more children, there's more food available. I'll spare you the biblical exegesis. You can find that in the book. But right after Noah invents the plow and there's prosperity, humanity destroys itself. People become licentious. There is rabid womanizing, and prosperity led to decadence. And then the flood comes and there's a restart. And then Noah invents something else, by the way. After the flood, we forget this, but Noah invents fermentation. He plants a vineyard and makes wine. That's the first mention of wine. So he invents chemistry. fundamentally. But again, Noah finds himself in a drunken stupor in his tent. So wine is an amazing thing. Like if you think about wine is water for the ancients because you couldn't find clean water, but alcohol was always clean. And so here too, you have called a dual use technology, wine, which could be used for amazing good, either enjoyed at a wedding or enjoyed with responsibility, or clean water. But it's abused in the story of Noah, much like the plow is abused for licentious behavior because of the prosperity. And I think the story of the flood and the story of Noah then being castrated by his son is instructive because it tells us that we have amazing innovations, but if society is not prepared with an ethical, moral framework to deal with it, it runs sideways. This has huge implications for today. Let's think about CRISPR, right? We don't yet have an ethical framework for CRISPR. We don't have a financial framework for CRISPR. We don't have an ethical framework for social media, for what it's worth at this point as an innovation. And we don't have one for autonomous vehicles. I'll tell an impolitic story. I was invited 4 years ago to speak at a rabbi's conference in Israel about autonomous vehicles. A well-known rabbi in Israel encouraged them to cancel my speech and cancel the conference because we can't talk about autonomous vehicles because people may come to use them on the Sabbath because you don't drive them, they run. And my takeaway from that is very simple. He's kind of right and kind of wrong, right? Which is, well, we have to talk about it, otherwise we can't get to an outcome and an ethical framework. But at the same time, we're not fully ready for these things. And when you think about the pandemic, and I'm fully convinced that there was a lab leak here, right? They were doing research. We can argue whether gain of function research on viruses is a good idea or a bad idea, but they were doing it. One thing is abundantly clear, which is it wasn't done with proper biosafety and biosecurity. And number two, we have zero ethical and moral framework or economic framework for gain of function research in biology. No one's created it. No one's popularized it. And it's a global problem. I had a meeting yesterday with somebody who told me, that he's worried about climate change. Okay. And I said to him, yelling about carbon doesn't solve the problem. Until we have a framework of the ethics of energy consumption or the economics of energy consumption that's global, it doesn't matter. And the same thing is true of biological research. And we need to spend our time thinking not just about the United States in this case, because these problems are global. Gain of function research is a global problem. Carbon consumption is a global problem. These are global problems. And if we fix them here or think we should fix them here, it doesn't actually solve the problem. So you need to take a leadership stance on this. I think that's the biblical imperative. Those are biblical narratives, is that they're global. They apply everywhere. And so if we get back to them, what I'm hoping is that we can universalize in some ways solutions, or at least framework for dealing with the problems. I'll just add, as mentioned in the book, that if you think that Noah's alone and dying in a drunken stupor or getting casually in a drunken stupor, Alfred Nobel went through the same thing, right? He invented dynamite dual-use technology. He thought it was going to bore holes in mountains for railroads. Instead, he created weapons out of it, and he went, to Italy and died in melancholy. These things repeat themselves over and over again in history. Thanks. What's your name?
David Burton. I spend a fair amount of my professional life trying to remove regulatory impediments for entrepreneurs and venture capitalists.
Thank you.
A lot of them. But I want to talk. I totally agree with you that our civil society is in decline, and that's having noticeable adverse effects, and that we need to reemphasize that. But there's also a danger here, because a lot of 501c3 type organizations are in effect agents of government. And I'll give a couple of examples, and also they're given tremendous advantages over entrepreneurs. Most universities probably get, either through grants or subsidized student loans, over 70% of their money from government, so they're dependent on government. There are branches of not-for-profits in the United States, like FINRA, which you're probably familiar with, where the government in effect delegates regulatory authority, and these are huge, powerful institutions, in some cases more powerful than government. Then Harvard, for example, if it were ranked in the Fortune 500, it'd be ranked Fortune 55. Right? It's a large multinational business with a little tail that's called a school. They therefore makes them tax exempt and exempt from massive other regulations. So we're to the point now where not-for-profits account for something like 8 or 9% of GDP. And Harvard, the large multinational enterprise it is, I mean, there's only 55 business corporations larger than Harvard in America. Pays less tax than a local dry cleaner, right? So to me, that's a problem. We structure our not-for-profits, so they have massive competitive advantage. They run large multinational businesses tax-free. It's no wonder they're successful. And then we've given them massive authority over our society, but they're really captive of government. And so we shouldn't be uncritical in terms of how we think about not-for-profits or civil society. It's more complex than that. It's not-for-profits good, business is bad, or whatever. I was wondering, in fact, what you thought about some of those issues, or if you thought about this.
Yeah, that was the illusion I made when I said that the 501c3 makes revenue. So we should not conflate, in my view, 501c3s with civil society. Those are not the same things. 501c3 is a funding mechanism. That's what it's become. I don't think it's a good one for what it's worth, for many of the reasons that you said. Number one, responsibility needs to devolve, in my view, to civic society. Otherwise, we just can't manage this thing at the pace it needs to manage. That's kind of level one of it. Level two is I actually think that civic businesses, organizations, it doesn't matter at a second, need to compete for funding over time, and having a constant stream of government funding to these 501c3s that's nearly guaranteed in policy is a terrible idea. And it's what happens when the Speaker of the Knesset once told me that the most certain thing you can assume is that 20 years after a law is enacted, it'll still be on the books, even if it's not relevant anymore. And the same thing is true when funding gets approved in governments. It just continues on. I think these things need to be reconsidered through digital tools very quickly after they're done. And one should not have persistent government funding of civic organs that are 501c3s. I don't believe in that. And I think they all need to be, and this is the third point, we arrive at the notion that we have for-profit and non-for-profit business. I think because of the notion of separation of church and state, or Jesus's admonition to the Jews, render unto Caesar that which is to Caesar, unto God that which is to God. And so the notion of a 501c3 was a religious institution to start, but it's gone way beyond that at this point. And we need to lose the dichotomy between nonprofit and for-profit on the nonprofit side. And we need to force what today we call nonprofits to actually become income earning things. We have a tool like this in Israel. It's called a Hebrew Cheletz. It's a company that earns revenues and just signs like a Ulysses contract on how it's going to distribute its profits.
Well, we have such a thing in the United States that basically over the past 12 years swept through the country. They're called benefit corporations, and now there's benefit LLCs.
Yeah.
They have a dual purpose.
No, this is different. This is so the B Corp eliminates B Corp for what it's worth, but is I think gone sideways. But the Israel one, it has one purpose, right? It's coming. But it doesn't distribute its profits, it reinvests them. Yeah. Just to the owners. That's kind of the key. I think the other question you're kind of implying, which is important to raise, there's the B Corp and C Corp and fiduciary duties, is the only thing we can measure as fiduciary is actually profits at the end of the day. It's really hard to measure everything else. In the book is, by the way, against impact investing. I don't believe in that. I think there's no such thing as double and triple bottom lines. That's very difficult to govern from a legal perspective. You'd be sued all day. That having been said, my argument, and that's why I talk about individual economic actors rather than government mandated metrics, is that the best businesses will be built on these principles. but I don't think I can legally mandate it. And I spent, when I spoke about free speech, et cetera, I think we have to draw some lines. I know this sounds very non-Washington, between legal expectations and customer, consumer, and civic expectations, and we've worked that out some.
Hi, Mike Gonzalez. I'm gonna have to go, so I apologize in advance. Just two.
I'm sorry I spoke so long.
I got two questions. One is a very quick one. What is your definition of consumption capitalism? And is that just a return to the emphasis that we had with the supply side on supply? Is that what you mean? And then I want to come back to another one. But
Joe Biden, the president of the United States, in a speech not long ago said, buy cars. After 9/11, George Bush said, go out, go shopping. And so while I'm fully aware that demand, consumer demand in particular, drives the economy, the ethos of consume to consume more, I think is extraordinarily dangerous. I think it's dangerous because it drives people to take credit that they can't afford for immediate consumption without creating an investment also in future. I think it leads to crazy ideas like endless stimulus packages, where we just drive prices way up because, consume demand without laying infrastructure. In my mind, for what it's worth, I hope this is not in politics, it's hilarious that we drive an infrastructure bill after we give people money to consume all day. So first we raise the prices until we consume, and then we're gonna pay more for it by doing an infrastructure bill. We should have done the inverse, which is infrastructure is our investment.
or not.
Or not.
So
But even according to those people who say we should, do those things, the stage of them is hilarious.
So your approach is what my good friend David here does, which to regulate and take other steps to make supply easier.
For sure, yes, but I think we also need to invest in things that produce more profits for the long term and infrastructure, right? So supply is definitely one. Supply is infrastructure, as many. Think about the semiconductor shortage right now. The semiconductor shortage is exactly a function of consumption capitalism, right? We didn't invest in the infrastructure because it was cheaper to consume the end goods by outsourcing it to China. And now we go, what the hell? What are we going to do? I got a question. You see these jeans? So I bought these jeans for a very simple reason. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was, which said that Brooks Brothers is making all of their jeans in the United States. And they're expensive, they're more expensive. But it caused me to ask, why were they doing this? And they were building a factory, I think it was in South Carolina, I'm not 100% sure, and to go do this. And well, it was more expensive because all manufactured clothing is moved overseas. But when you looked at it, the other thing was the dyes they used were far less carcinogenic than what's being used over there. And so for years, no one wanted to invest in this infrastructure because it was cheaper to consume the stuff that came from China. But America built quality, and America built stuff that took care of its citizens. But we lost that in this notion of consumption capitalism.
All right, and then the other one was, and I'm sorry, I have to make it quick, is that what you're arguing for is what we're all trying to figure out, how to make virtue sexy again. And as the Bible tells us, you have to have the crisis point that Noah faced. The junkie needs to reach rock bottom before he or she decides, I gotta get rid of the needle. And then even then it becomes really hard. So how do you propose to do this? Because we're all trying to figure it out.
So that's a good question. I'll say three things. One of my best friends is now the Director General of the Housing Ministry of Israel, and he keeps getting offered government jobs. And I kept saying to him, don't go, you need a giant crisis. And as things got worse in Israel, the housing prices kept going up, he kept asking me, I keep getting offered this job. I go, no, it's not bad enough yet. It's not bad enough yet. It's not bad. When The Economist said that Tel Aviv is the most expensive city in the world, then it was bad enough. And so he went and took the job. He's now Director General of the Housing Ministry. And so, yes, I agree, you need a crisis. But I think there's another thing, which is, give me a second to put an Israeli context on it, then I'll move to the US. So Israel does this terrible thing.
it measures itself and its economy by OECD metrics. Okay, no disrespect to the United States, which is the most important economy in the OECD. The other 39 countries in the OECD are, a large number of them are sketchy economies. And they show no similarity to the Israeli economy. We have 3.2 children per woman. Most of the average in these is like 1.3. Our high-tech economy is 50% of our exports at this point, 32% of our tax receipts. No other economy in the OECD looks like it's ridiculous. And it doesn't talk about the values that we care about. And so because of that, I think we keep getting things wrong in Israel because we measure by the wrong metrics. We're looking at these OECD metrics that are like Greece and Mexico, and it's, come on. And I think the same thing is true here. The thing I want to spend my time doing now is creating the measurements and metrics of what you call sexy, making virtue sexy again. Without measurement, and this is what the B Corp failed to do, by the way, in my view. There isn't a set of metrics, it's a set of kumbaya ideas to do it. But I think smart people working together can go build a set of metrics that looks different for this. I go back to my genes, right? What's the premium people are willing to pay not to have cancer for 20 years later? I'm not saying it's directly correlated, but you get the point. What is the premium willing to pay to make sure that a community in South Carolina has economic resilience? There are prices to these things, and that's why I called it sacrifice and investment. You need to invest to do it. It won't come accidentally, but we don't measure it today. The only thing we measure is what's the price of this individual good. We put it against China, we put it against this, and it doesn't work that way. So if we don't build the metrics and then measure everybody else by it, we can't do it. And the thing I'm most excited about is this book has been like a revelation. I had no idea, legit no idea. My publisher just thought we'd sell 500 books, and on a good day it'd be 1,000. It's gone a lot better than that. And I did too, for what it's worth, just to be honest. And I think we got involved in this conversation. We're talking now about setting up an institute to build metrics for a better measured economy around what you call making virtue sexy again. I think there's something there. I don't know what it is yet.
I just want to piggyback on this. I think that this is a really important conversation that's taking place, it's taking place in this country as well. And we have some policymakers that are thinking of it in terms of policy. And I'm wondering if, the arena where the change occurs is, in the family, in the culture, in the churches, where those values are shaped and where those choices, the ethical framework that you mentioned, is hashed out appropriately, along the lines of values, where then that can be grounded, and then those choices are made, those trade-offs are made for price versus that set of values. But I think the thing that makes some people nervous, and I would admit makes me nervous also, is that the ethical framework enters, the debate over what that ethical framework looks like enters the political space. And we are such a divided country right now where those, I think, that have captured the elite institutions wouldn't necessarily, I think, have this longer term vision. The kind of America, I grew up in when I was quite young was, you paid your own way, you didn't have credit, you did layaway, you did, you built, you built your life and you taught your children to kind of pay their own way. And now it's, it's a very different kind of life, but it's going to take, change at the level of what Dave Ramsey does through churches and getting people's, financial makeovers and, all those kinds of things, where it's much more, I think, a cultural, it's a very big conversation, but it's that ethical framework. And then I think this covenantal capitalism is very interesting, but I think we see this in the United States throughout the small business sector, where you have entrepreneurs building business, not just for, kind of getting rich necessarily, but they're thinking in terms of their children working in the business, passing it down to their grandchildren. They will carry a supplier, they will carry a customer because they're part of the community. I mean, it's much more of a connected form of capitalism. So I think we do see perhaps, examples of that, but it's, it's in that smaller where we are directly connected. unto each other.
What's your name?
Bridget.
Bridget.
Yeah.
I agree. I want to add one component to the point. I know this is Washington DC. I think the notion that government will do this and do it well is unlikely.
Right.
And I think this is grassroots and needs to be done at a grassroots level. And I think it's doable at a grassroots level. And that's the piece I want to add to your equation. It's not just families and churches and the small businesses. It's actually technology and technology companies. I don't think people in this room thinking about making virtue sexy again or the values, they view technology companies as at odds with that. But the fastest spreader of information and cultural norms by a long shot today is technology. It is the most viral carrier of the values imbued in it. And if we're serious about what you're talking about, the policy fight in Washington is a sideshow in my view. And the policy or the educational conversation on campuses is lost for the most part. And so if you want to disrupt the model, you need to go another way. And I think there is a real ally over time in technology, in communities of faith or traditional values to go make this work. And I think it's real. And I think, the question about have we hit the crisis yet? We're close. And getting there quickly.
California.
And getting there quickly. And divisiveness is because it's in the political rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
When people when I'm making the book on in Hebrew, I've already written Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and now Numbers is coming out on May the 1st. The English version of Exodus hopefully will be at the end of the year. But in the book on Leviticus, one of the cases I make is we used to think that if we like someone or share values with them, we work together. I don't think that's true. I think by working together, we build values that we share. So if we can infuse these investments and partnerships with this conversation, people work together, we can bridge a lot of divisiveness, but it's got to start grassroots. And the basic thing is, I never had a good way to describe this. And maybe 2 months ago, I saw a tweet from a guy named Josh Wolf, a brilliant guy, that put this into perspective for me. So if something has a 1 in a million chance of happening, you say it's really unlikely, right? Except it happens 8 times a day in New York. Because 8 million people there. And so in the old days, even 8 times a day, you wouldn't hear about it. But today, when something happens 8 times a day in New York, everyone hears about it on Twitter and Facebook, et cetera. So the bizarre or the unlikely happens. So if you got 1,000 small businesses, people, these things, and it was happening once a week and you didn't just change the narrative, but you narrated the change of that in a social media way, you could change the narrative in a country actually much faster than you think. You just need to string the story together.
I want to ask a question about something you mentioned early on.
What was your name?
Brett Schaefer. And you were talking about mandatory military service, mandatory government service early on. And you implied that would instill a sort of a civic value or moral ethical practices in people that is absent without it. I don't want to speak to the military service. Jim probably knows quite a bit more about that based on his military service. Did you overlap with the drafter?
I do know more about that.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah. No, I mean, but I mean, I was wondering if you want to talk about that. But I do question whether government is the proper vehicle to be instilling civil, ethical, or moral virtue in a population through mandatory public service. And I wanted you to sort of expand on that.
The Israeli government, for what it's worth, doesn't instill the virtue. It insists that you give time. That's not a libertarian view of the world. Well, certainly, but it insists that you give time. And if we think that patriotism and community and solidarity is important for the survival of a country, we need people to give time for something greater than themselves. And so my two oldest daughters who did national service decided on their own. They had free choice. The government says you got to go do this. And then, for what it's worth, different civic groups compete for where these national service people will go. Like the military, by the way, competes on talent too. And so my two oldest daughters went to a socioeconomically challenged community in the south of Tel Aviv. They met people they'd never met again in their lives. They became connected to the communities, and one daughter really wants to move back there and try to help work from there. She'll go to her job, whatever it is, but live there and rebuild the community. And I think that they say what the values were. You got to go do it.
So here's the difference. I think the Israeli experience is great for Israel, but here's the difference. Israel, since its creation, has been in a perpetual state of threat. That means that there's a real reason for people to serve, because we've had conscription and drafts, and actually in times of need, the World War I, where it's worked out fine, in times of when we didn't really need it, we had it anyway, it worked out really bad. Government can never really abuse that system, because there's an actual real threat that, regardless of whether it's a liberal government or conservative, that the country has to face. And so the government can never really take those institutions and abuse them for other purposes, because there's a real purpose for them. And because it's such a small country and there's such a great need, you can make a sense that the entire population needs to be engaged. America is 330 million people. On our best day, if we really stretched it, we could maybe use 5 million people in uniform. If we had everybody in the age group, in the middle, you're probably talking like, I don't know, 80, 90 million people.
Yeah.
Which we have absolutely no real use for. And since there's no driving national purpose for that, what government will do is find a purpose for that. And we'll have, if this was the Biden administration, we'd have 80 million people in climate corps, right? And so government will abuse that power because there is no corrective national purpose not to do that. And to the other point, which is, I don't think the argument you're making is that government is going to teach virtue, right? Because that's just simply not true, that national service would teach virtue, that government teaches virtue. That's just nonsense. So that's just not true. But your point is because these people got together and did this national experience, they gained a sense of community and purpose and everything. Don't disagree with that. But what I would argue is there's lots of other models to achieve that purpose, which don't require national service. And in a healthy civil society, in a healthy country, there's millions of ways to do that. So I can just give you an example of my family. So I would say the living, productive, primogeniture of my parents is now 35 people. Out of those 35 people, 3 of us have served in the military, 1 in a whole military career, the other 2 in part career. Out of those 35 people, do you know how many do public service? 35. Teachers, doctors, nurses, cops, whatever. So how did the other 33 gain this notion of commitment and service, the kind of virtues that you would want? And the answer is, lots of ways. And so I just think that that's a great model for Israel. And conceptually, I understand the notion of teaching virtue, and that virtue doesn't, come out of thin air, that it has to be taught. But the notion that there's a prescriptive model for doing that and that it fits well with each nation, I don't agree with that.
I hear that. I'll just say the following. Your family is super unique.
No, they're not.
They are.
No.
So, I'm just going to ask you the questions for the sake of asking it. What percentage of the U.S. population is family with 35 issue do you think, or even 10 issue, do you think has 100% commitment to civil service?
Here's what
I'll take the over under 5.
Here's what I would do. Here's how I would do the math. I would say, give me the percentage of Americans that graduated from high school, went and got a job, got married, raised their kids, and didn't get divorced. Take that percentage and then match that up against my family, and you know
You're
what?
doing well.
Your numbers are really good. So the
Yeah.
problem is not, I think in America, the problem is you're not getting educated, you're not getting married, you're not raising kids,
I
you're
agree with
not
that.
getting a job, you're not getting a family. National service doesn't solve that problem. And if if all those other problems were solved, national service, but look, here's the thing in America. 75-80% of American youth couldn't be in the military anyway. They don't qualify.
Yeah, Peace, I get that. That's why it's a national service.
But again, what you have is the David Burton problem, is the federal government will literally be throwing people into sectors to do stuff that a lot of other people can do more efficiently and more better under this notion of this potential gain of virtue, which may or may not emerge. What's more likely to emerge is because it's a government structured national service program, they're going to get indoctrinated in stupid government stuff. And they're going to come to believe that government is actually the font of all knowledge and wisdom and paychecks.
We have lots of.
Right, because that didn't happen during the pandemic.
No, that's exactly, and again, the difference between Israel and the United States is, Israel's a lovely country. This is 300 million people and the largest or second largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
And to put all that manpower and money and power into the federal government, dude, you might as well just light a match and, have the smoke next to the gasoline.
I feel like I lit a match on that.
That's great.
Not to pile on with Dr. But and there's another component of that problem, which is that, I'm assuming you did Hester in Israel.
No, I didn't.
No, you didn't. You did pure army
No,
military.
I was in America.
You were okay. So you were a lost cause. But did your kids do Hester?
Well, you have to tell us what
You-
that's.
you-
Yeah.
There's-
And I would go with it.
There's, so my boys who have gone to the military, my daughter's in national service, my boys who have gone to the military, one is now what's called, so in Israel, you can do the military basically three ways. You can go straight to the military and do 3 years. You can go to what's called an Army preparatory program for a year or two, and then do 3 or more years in the military. That's what two of my sons did. They studied Torah, Bible for 2 years, and then went to the military, and each spent 4.5 years and they were become officers. And now my third one is what's called a Hesder program, specific for religious kids, which is, it's a 5-year program, which you do religious studies roughly 3.5 out of the years, and military service and dispersed for 1.5 years there. So it's a longer commitment, but less.
But
military.
reduced.
Yeah.
And the reason I was bringing that up is because I think your son would agree that it was actually the yeshiva experience that did much more to instill his values. And going into the army was merely an opportunity to express those values and that commitment. Another difference in the American experience is, besides the government control side, is the attitude of the populace. The reason why conscription came to an end in the Vietnam era is because so much of America's youth were committed to the idea that America was fundamentally doing a bad thing, that being in Vietnam was evil, and the veterans coming home were not to be celebrated, but to be regarded as evil occupiers and demonic and all those terrible things they now say about Israel, for example. But if today, when you've got this equity things going on, that the fundamental racism is so built into the culture that it's fundamentally evil and wrong, and all police forces are an agency of evil and wrong, so that black police officers are racist against black people. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me too. But when you think about that in a conscription model, you would be bringing in a massive populace of young Americans who fundamentally believe that the army is an evil institution and their entire objective is to rip it down. And so you have nothing like that in Israel, and the occasional what was that? And not breaking the silence, but there was a guy who shot the video where his entire corps around him said, "Shakhan, you're a liar." Every one of them said, "We know what happened, and we know you're lying." In America, the same thing would happen, and half the force would coalesce around him to defend him and uplift his lies.
I'll say a few things. One is, I don't think any of us know how it would turn out, which is that oftentimes we come in with assumptions and apply them to the circumstance, but the change of venue and change of modality ends up changing the zeitgeist. We've seen that many times. The other thing I'll argue is that we often refer to the post-World War II generation, which by the way, had a lot of those families where marriages stayed together. I don't think it's an accident that it came after all these people going off to World War II.
But, and I would say, that's
Correlation or causation, I
the
don't know.
vast majority of people that fought in World War II were volunteers. Only a very small percentage of the actual forces drafted.
I don't know, but
I know,
either way they served. I just, my grandfather was conscripted, but they served in the military together and lifted things together and came back to their families inside that family.
But see here, that's.
How that's an accident.
No, but that just gets to the point is it, and I don't disagree with you, but it's they were together, they served a common purpose, they had to care for each other, they had to serve each other. A lot of those guys went back and they went into the private sector and they had that same kind of experience. So it's not necessarily that it was the military, it just happened that they had that virtuous experience in the military. And that's different from saying the military will give a virtuous. So for example, I was in the Army 25 years. I never had an operational deployment. Nobody ever shot at me ever. I was never in the foxhole next to my buddy caring for his life. And that's the way, and in contrast, we now have a generation of people in the military that have been deployed 5, 10, 15 times and been shot at a lot.
Oh, yeah.
But this is the geostrategic thing. It's the nature of the American military. We're not going to be in an Israeli experience of constant threat and danger where people are going to be subjected to a bonding experience that will make them better people. But our history is just not like that, unless we want to be fighting wars like the Roman legion every day. So we just can't duplicate. We just can't duplicate the Israeli experience.
So,
And then, God bless someday when the Abraham Accords, flood across, the Middle East and Israel is just the country next door.
Yeah.
Israeli conscription will evaporate.
I hope not.
It will.
we only have a few more minutes, and I know that both Anthony and Ellie had questions. I want to see if you could do two final questions.
30-second one, but it's just quick.
This one will be about economics. I'm sorry.
Yes, but going back to some of your other points, I really enjoyed it. You remind me, so Dan Center, Salt Center, they wrote this Startup Nation.
Yeah.
Now, I think what you're telling us is really how to scale up. You already started something. The question is, how do we go from here? So you mentioned matrix. I think the problem we are facing today is we are so much focusing on output, input and output equation. China is very much an example here. But I think we should focus on outcome better than output. And outcome is very different from output. So the matrix you're talking about, I thought it's a capacity-oriented matrix, perhaps. Not necessarily about the size and GDP and growth rate, but how to build up, how to scale up. On that note, my quick question is, where do you want to go from here? So you're a venture capitalist, you wrote 2 books, you're visiting Washington to talk about your ideas. What's your next chapter and how can we facilitate your journey?
Thank you for that. I am
Well, venerable, by the way.
more than the national service piece. The thing I'm most interested in is this topic, which is what metrics can we limit out to build a more mutually prosperous society? I'll tell you.
For greatest number of people.
Yeah, it's a side point, but you'll understand it. So generally, people or governments will measure average salary, average income, and sometimes they'll measure median income. I went to one of the senior people in the finance ministry in Israel, and I said, I think we got this wrong. What we actually need to measure is the number of people who've crossed the median line every year. Last year's median line this year. Because that's a measure of progress. Actually, if the median goes up as a number, it's actually less impactful than what N crossed the line. They thought it was a terrible idea, but for obvious reasons. But that's the thing I'm focused on right now. I'm toying with the idea of setting up a group, an institute. I don't know what. I hate the notion of an institute to do this because I want to actually do projects and investments rather than just think. That attempt to set out these metrics and set out the making virtue sexy again framework for doing this, and then also to attempt to build ethical guidelines for nettlesome technology issues. And I think we're gonna have many more of them much faster than anyone thinks. I think a gain of function in CRISPR
Absolutely.
this is, we're getting started.
We'd love to stay in touch.
Could you say CRISPR 10 more times? Because I'm trying to get people in building to focus on this. So just keep saying it. So
Biodefense and biosecurity.
yeah. No, that's good. Hey, so looking at, the conception of poverty, right? Which is in the United States largely defined as how much money do you make?
Yeah.
Right. And it doesn't go right to your issue because it's literally a concept based on material gain.
Yes.
And the same administration which says don't eat meat, right? And then turn around, but we have to lift these people out of poverty, which is and which is a version of material law. I mean, my family was poor. We were the happiest people on the planet. I didn't care what side of the poverty line we were on.
This is a really deeply religious point in my view and a civic point. People find prosperity not just in money and in consumption. There's this great article that appeared in the Israeli press this week about that the government measures the basket of goods. And the way they do it, by the way, is they call people on a panel out. They have this notion of what the basket of goods is. By the way, the last time the basket of goods was updated was like in 2013 or something like that, right? So people want different things, obviously, but it's not just that. It doesn't tell me, right? I didn't buy X, Y, and Z because I had a different value. And so it's a really incomplete methodology, but all government policy is based on this. And so there was a study done of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. So it's a fascinating study. So they earn less money, they spend less money, but they consistently rate very high on happiness scores. And by the way, they don't give a bigger percentage of money to charity necessarily, but they give charity more often. They actually go, how's that possible? And, it's stuff we don't capture today, but it is stuff that leads to a better society over the long term. This, Anthony's point before, I'm not sure if it's inputs, outputs, outcomes, or there's another word that we're missing.
Maybe,
But to describe which is, and I don't say this in a kind of socialist communist way, but in more of a communitarian way, which is there should be some metric that measures the economic resilience of community. At the beginning of COVID, I launched a project in Israel called, in Hebrew it's called Medina Mufet, which means exemplar nation. And the reason I launched it was the government wanted to give out all this money. They called me a bunch of questions, and I go, who are we giving it to? Why are we giving it to them? They said, well, anyone who lost their job or so. Okay, whatever. So I said, well, what's your measure of whether somebody can take this money and get back on their feet? And I discovered there's no metric of economic resilience for families and communities. No one even thinks this way.
Yeah, so there's a fair amount of research on disaster response, right?
Correct. A disaster response.
But what's very interesting is there is not an economic correlation between community resilience and response to disaster and wealth. So rich communities can be very not resilient, and poor communities can actually be very resilient. And it's not, the difference is not economics. It's not just that Louisiana parishes were poor. It's that they didn't have family, they didn't have community, they didn't have faith-based institutions. They didn't have anything those are the things that actually build resilience in a community, not actually how wealthy it is.
Yeah, I'm making a different point, which is not what is the cause of the resilience, but whether you are capable of economic resilience. Like I give it crazy, it's a crazy example. So we went out and actually interviewed people, lots of them, to try to understand these guys. So we found people in the south of Israel who lost their jobs. And they couldn't get another job. And you guess why? It wasn't because they didn't have skills. It was because, in 4 or 5 of the cases, there wasn't somebody to take care of an elderly parent who did this. Now, these are totally solvable problems around economic resilience, but we have no data and we have no measurement for it. So we created an economic resilience index, and we created it and we put it into motion. And then we discovered that it was useless. Why is it useless? Not because the data is not valuable, not because the insights are not valuable. We couldn't operationalize it with any policy or whatever. So we launched another sprint around kind of a national employment initiative, not to get people employed, but to just expose all the jobs. There's nothing we discovered. By the way, apparently in Missouri had the same problem. I don't know anyone else. So if you're a Mexican immigrant to Israel. If you're an immigrant to Israel or Israeli, and the job says, in order to get this job, you need to speak English. So you go out and take a course and learn English. It turns out that in the ATS, the applicant tracking systems of many of these places, there are different gradations for English knowledge. In the certificate issued by the training system, it's on a different grade. So if people would take these courses, but they couldn't get the jobs, even though they had the skills.
Right, because
Just of a data mismatch.
So this actually, I don't mean to monopolize, I was just saying, this figure, this is, I think part of what you're doing is, part of this is virtue, but part of this is also transparency. Right, which was, this is public choice theory. Well, people will make logical choices if they have all the information that's available to them. So if people knew that the dye was carcinogenic. If they knew that, they might buy the more expensive jeans, right? But it's not that they want cancer, it's just that nobody told them that.
I think it's more than that, it's more than transparency. We need to articulate it in the right framework. It's part of narrating the change and not just.
Well, yeah, I think, oftentimes people need to understand, look, people make decisions. I mean, I think we're pretty clear that if you smoke, you could get cancer.
Yeah.
And people smoke anyway.
Yes.
Okay, they
A lot fewer.
yes, and that's right. It is, and you're not gonna get everybody, but
Yeah.
so I do think that.
I advocate for that a lot in this
Yeah.
book, and particularly the next one.
Yeah, so I mean, this notion of, transparency in the marketplace is a big part of what makes capitalism work. In addition to, and that's the other thing is transparent for what? What am I gonna do with that knowledge? Well, it goes back to what do I value? And you really have to have both, right? You have to say, this is what I value, and transparency helps me make better decisions to satisfy my values.
Goes back to David.
Mhm.
Goes back to David was saying also, we don't know a lot of this stuff.
Right.
And so, researchers in Washington may know, but 90% of people don't know this.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
So I will be the annoying person who asks a question at the end of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us. A topic that I've heard come up a lot is civil society in our conversation today, and things like family and faith and institutions and churches. As you were writing this book and doing research, were there any particular passages in the Hebrew Bible that stood out to you as really important for helping us think about how we revive civil society? Because I think we can agree that unfortunately civil society has been quite weak. It's been on that trajectory for a long time. So where in your book would you advise we turn, or in your research?
Okay. In this one, it's in the later chapters of what went wrong in Egypt with Joseph's economic policy. And so that's in this book. In the book on Leviticus, I have a large chapter on this topic, and it relates to what I said earlier about this Jewish view of how you enable the poor to have dignity. There's one piece in the Exodus book and one piece in the Leviticus book on the same topic from opposite angles. We need to think as a society of how we improve people's economic outcomes and why that is materially impactful for me as well. And in the 21st century, as I think was true from time immemorial, as it's easier to point to right now, when people talk about the skills gap, it's a solvable problem. It's, I think, a really solvable problem. It's unlikely solvable by the government, though, and probably shouldn't be solved, at least in my point of view, by the government. The government doesn't do these things. But if you think about the job of wealthy people, business owners, landowners, whatever, the biblical term would be a landowner, and in modern times it's a business owner, to say, we can create a win-win where if I got a factory and I'm a profitable business, I can take on an extra 2 or 3 employees. That gives me resilience in my system, so I don't have to shut down from COVID. They get trained, so they get a skill. I may or may not have a job for them after 6 or 12 months, but if I take someone off the unemployment roll or someone is in a lower skilled job and upskill them as part of my business, I also create slack in my business. And if COVID has taught us something, is that we all need slack in our business. And I think business owners, if we can talk to them about this, could adopt this and can afford it. In Israel, I tried to advocate, it's a smaller country, that if the government should shut down what they call the Employment Bureau, and I call the Chronic Unemployment Bureau. And instead they should provide a tax rebate to profitable businesses that take on employees and train them for extra resilience in the business. I think that's a policy initiative that would, maybe change the narrative on this, but that's kind of, I think, the biggest one. If business owners
did this and helped upskill the people, it's an enlightened self-interest in my view, just, tough to describe it as an investment for people. They think there's an immediate cost, but I think we can get there. That's one big one. The second one, so I'm radically against government regulation. There's a piece on that in this book and 2 pieces in the Leviticus book. And like I said, it's still in Hebrew. But I also think we need to figure out how to do civic resolution of commercial disputes instead of court resolution. So we're wasting tons of time and money on this. And if we can solve it in communities, we obviously can't do this for international commercial disputes, but there's a ton of commercial disputes across this country, et cetera, that are reasonably regional or local. And if we can devolve that to civic institutions in certain ways, or even churches on some level, I think that would go a long way, one, to reducing costs of insurance, costs of lawyers, costs of all sorts of stuff like that, and to creating more mutual responsibility. You'll be less likely to fraud someone or screw them over if you've got to go appear before a civic body, a local or regional civic body to go do it. Then if that's an anonymous court.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks for all the great questions. I know we had a lot of them as well.